Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to the third session of Introduction to International Relations. In this session, we're going to be looking at realism, which is one of the main 6 theories that we're going to go into more detail in this session, or this lecture, and the next 5 lectures. As you know, we've covered a fair amount of ground already. First session, we touched upon a range of IR theories, i.e. realism, liberalism, constructivism, Marxism, critical theory, feminism, and post-structuralism. And we looked at the history of the subject, how it's evolved as a discipline, etc., and how it relates, the theories themselves relate to various issue areas. Now, though, in the third session, this is where, and for the next number of sessions, this is where I'm going to go into an individual theory and go much deeper than the first session in that sense. The second session, as you may recall, we looked at the United Nations, its history, its evolution, key agencies and bodies that make up the UN, and how, in a sense, this cobweb of different international institutions and organizations make up what we know as global governance, and touching upon different areas again, like international security, humanitarian intervention, development, etc. But for now, I want to crack on with realism / neo-realism, my presentation for this session, and I'm going to share the screen with you. And as you may recall from the first 2 sessions again, as you also notice, I like to refer back to previous lectures, video lectures you've already seen, to connect and show linkages. There's always, or often, I should say, an image that I put up that represents an analogy for what I'm going to do, and in this case, what the theory is. So, looking at this picture, you obviously, it could be a photo taken from space almost, and a photo of the world, planet Earth. But the key thing there of planet Earth in front is a chessboard. And the chessboard is an important analogy that I think is useful for realism / neo-realism. And don't worry, I'm going to differentiate. I did a bit in the first session, but I'm going to do it in much more detail in this session between classical realism and neo-realism. But you can see here a chessboard, and you can see 2 sides. And the chess pieces. And there's constant tactics. You're constantly thinking, how can I get in an advantageous position regarding myself, let's say actor A against actor B. And remember again from the first session, realists, unlike many of the other theories and theorists, put an emphasis, a direct emphasis of states being the most important unit of analysis. For other theories, the state is still very important, but realism, they particularly stress that. And they stress the point that we live in an insecure world. Collaboration is not straightforward. Why? Because we live in this anarchical system where there's no supranational authority to protect us, to guide us, to shape us. So we need to survive. Then from survival, perhaps we can prosper. And it's not the case that we can't have relations with others, but we should always be careful and cautious that other actors are not going to take advantage of us. So we can have a good enough relationship. We can balance of power, which I'll be going into later. We work with other state actors so that there's no one state actor that becomes all powerful against us, and we balance. But here you can see in chess, it's what's known as a zero-sum game. Zero-sum is this notion that one side wins, the other side loses. So A wins, B loses. Now, again, in the first session, I made a comparison between realism and liberalism, and I used 2 terms which connect with economics, microeconomics. One is relative gains, and the other is absolute gains. Relative gains, as you may recall, is if one side, actor A, let's say Germany, because we're going to use nation states for this example, gets 8, France gets 6, you may remember this example. Germany has got a relative gain over France. On the other hand, absolute gains is when Germany and France interact via trade, via cultural exchange, whatever, diplomatic, whatever the case might be. Usually liberals emphasize trade. Both sides can benefit. It's a win-win situation, absolute gains. Now, again, realists are not against collaboration. They're not saying that you can't work close together. And they themselves often emphasize the importance of restraint. So sometimes they can also be anti-war in that sense. Paradoxically, you might think, because their emphasis on security is on politico-military relations. You should only go to war, for instance, according to a realist, if it comes under this absolute necessity of the national interest. Now, going back to this chess analogy, you can see both sides constantly being tactical with one another, and the strategy eventually is to checkmate the other side. So again, we live in a world that's where you can't fully ever trust anyone else. You can't ever know what their intentions are going to be in the future, etc., etc. So it's often what's known as zero-sum thinking. So now, going into a little bit of historical context, as I will do with each of the theories. So realism has been, and still arguably is, the dominant theory of international relations, world politics, since really the academic subject, international relations, in the post-First World War context came into being. And it's not the case that realism is the only theory, as you're going to come across other theories in more detail. Liberalism and Marxism have always been important, significant theories of international relations in the last 80, 90 years, what have you. And really, towards the end of the Cold War, constructivism, feminism, critical theory, post-structuralism, these more critical theories have become more important, and therefore realism is not necessarily front and center anymore, but it's still a very important, largely speaking, arguably predominant theory in international relations. And outside the academy, realism, in terms of, as you can see on this slide, some major thinkers of political thought, political philosophy, what have you. So you look at, let's say, a key ancient Greek thinker, historian, Thucydides, when he was looking at the history of the Peloponnesian War, the relations between Athens and Sparta 2,500 years ago, a rising Sparta, a declining Athens, and balancing against each other, and the inevitability that it may lead that it could very likely lead to conflict, etc., etc. Thucydides, in this sense, looks at international politics, international relations as, well, it's driven by, again, human nature, which we're going to be talking about, classical realism, that mankind, humankind, that they want to struggle for power. And how do you struggle? You struggle for power through a polis. And the polis is community from Greek. But in today's 20th, 21st century context, the nation state is what makes up the community, the political community. And that's, in a sense, how Thucydides' work still has impact on realist thinkers. Hans Morgenthau, a post-Second World War thinker, will be coming to his work and how Thucydides had an influence on him. And this type of thinking is still today. Graham Allison, an important foreign policy analysis scholar, he looks at a rising China in the US today and argues that there's a Thucydides trap. Can it be the case that the US and China, a rising China, arguably a declining US, and that's a big debatable point, will that lead inevitably to conflict? Not necessarily, and this is where theory again becomes important, but some realists would be pessimistic and say, well, actually, if we look at history, often a rising power and a declining power, it leads inexorably to a negative outcome. Of course, the US and China having a world war, arguably, this is not hyperbole, could be Armageddon. So we think and we work towards that not happening, obviously. But anyway, now we go to Machiavelli, the great Italian Renaissance thinker. And again, The Prince being a great text of his, an important political philosophy and political theorist. And the principles, this notion of principles, when you hear people, a political actor and a social actor talking about principles, we need to have principles, our values, our ethics, all well and good according to Machiavelli, but not so fast. Because we have to look at the political and power configurations that make up world politics, and actually the state leader, he or she needs to think strategically what represents his or her community, nation state in today's language, and how we achieve it. And if that means that the principles needs to be bypassed or we need to be flexible with it, then so be it, according to Machiavelli. And the final major thinker that I want to cite here is Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century English political theorist. And a great work is Leviathan, again in political philosophy, a text you will come across, or maybe have come across. And he looks again at human nature, that human beings have this insatiable lust for power, and that life is a state of nature, and actually we need a social contract to protect us, so an authority structure in place to protect us from our worst excesses. Again, there's a lot more that one could speak about Hobbes and these other thinkers, but the key point here is that there's a pessimistic element to these things, and also critique them in terms of that some of their ideas become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you can't trust others, then that can lead to actually this negative outcome. And that's where constructivism and critical theories tend to critique realists. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you can't trust, then that's inevitable of what takes place. But actually, if you create institutions according to liberal institutionalists or according to constructivists or critical theorists, these belief systems, you have a relationship with the other side, you're socializing with this other side, maybe you can become friends rather than enemies. It's not inevitable, point being, that it leads to a negative outcome. However, these very significant thinkers that I've just cited do actually have an importance to how the world is seen and how policymakers arguably think in some ways, at least. And a key term that I've referred to, and in the first set of slides and also today, is anarchy, anarchical system. So again, no supra above, Latin above, no supranational authority. We state A, state B, state C, state D need to protect ourselves, survive, and find our own security. And that might be by building up one's own military, economy, whatever the case, or aligning oneself with other state actors to protect from another powerful actor in a particular region or neighborhood. But we can never take security for granted. Therefore, again, this pessimistic approach to international relations, international security. Now, going into one of the two approaches of realism, and again, realism, as I've spoken about, an anarchical system, security, survival, security, balance of power, power being the subjective material thing. Each of these things are all under the umbrella of realism. However, we can differentiate between classical realism and neo-realism, which is also in your reading text homework. Reading in the textbook for your homework, excuse me. So now, classical realism. Really, we're going into the interwar period again, between the First and Second World War, the 1930s, and this debate between realists and idealists. We now know, of course, the most destructive war in human history, the Second World War, and the horrors of the Second World War, the Holocaust and so on and so forth, that actually maybe human nature is not all good. And so really at the end of, and clearly in the case of the Second World War, we can see the worst aspects of human nature, depending on how we conceptualize human nature, of course. But basically, at the end of the Second World War, realism really was seen as the predominant theory in international relations. Why? Because great thinkers like Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, who I'll be referring to some of their works later, they had already seen that actually were pessimistic about the frailty of human nature, that human nature is, let's say, self-interested, is vain, is egotistical, is liable to want to seek power, etc., etc. And we have to understand this at the level, so that's even a very micro level unit of looking at the individual and how he or she strategizes, but bring it up much more meso to the macro and look at how this works between, in this case, realists, between state actors on a more macro, international, or even global level. And we need to look at this in a scientific way, dispassionate way, not that we're being overly subjective, but we need to strive for objectivity in terms of how we see it. How do policymakers think? How do they strategize? What does it mean for Nigeria or Brazil or Japan or Russia in relations to their neighborhood and in some issue area of trade or security or environmental issues, whatever the case might be? So, objective laws. Now, you'll see, according to constructivists, this notion of objective laws is not correct. Why? Because we socialize, we construct our laws through a socialization process, whereby, as I said in the first set of slides, a brute fact like gravity is not the same as a social fact like traffic lights, which we've created these laws, norms, rules over time. But realists argue a constructivist, and we'll come back to constructivists obviously in the fifth presentation, but actually we have to think materially, we have to think there are objective laws, and if we try to go against them, then this will be bad for our nation state. So there's an anarchical system, and that means we shouldn't fully trust others. And this, again, this is where classical realists are different to neo-realists, we'll hear about later. It lies in the origins of human nature. So individuals at the most micro level, all the way up to the state, and the individuals, the political actors that represent the state. Unfortunately, it's inevitable that this nature is to create this order to do things. And again, one can cite these great political theorists again, that actually it's the responsibility of a statesman, stateswoman, to actually protect his or her community and the nation state. And that's how it's seen over the last hundreds of years and in the 21st century. But again, it's inevitable that conflict and competition is going to be around. Okay, it's inevitable. And again, you have to see that if we assume that assumption is correct, then actually one has to be very circumspect, smart, shrewd, tactical, strategic in terms of how one benefits vis-a-vis others. Again, that notion, that analogy of a chessboard becomes important. The state is sovereign. We spoke a lot about sovereignty also in the last set of slides, United Nations, international organizations, evolution. But yeah, and this is an emphasis that's put on, and especially in the post-Second World War context. In the literature, you often hear about the Westphalian system. You may remember again from the last set of slides, the treaties of Westphalia, 1648, in Europe, various different kingdoms and dukes agreeing certain natural boundaries, and later on in 1713, and the various religious practices, whether Catholic or Protestant, would be practiced exclusively in these different boundaries. 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, where sovereignty was much more enshrined. So that has a historical context. So Westphalian system is a term you may come across time and again when you study international relations. But the state is sovereign. And actually, again, main unit of analysis is, and Kenneth Waltz, who refers to unit of analysis, is that the state. And the state recognizes no authority above themselves. And that they are front and center to international relations, unlike some of the other theories that we've come across and will come across. So again, liberals, Marxists, constructivists, feminists would bring in much more non-state actors, and also the structures, how they play a role, and how actually things are not so much predetermined according to some of these other theories. So states are unified actors. The black box of the state, So you have the prime minister or the president or the chancellor and his or her cabinet, foreign ministry, treasury, whatever the case, it might, parliament. So there are key sort of like elements, executive, legislative branches, but broadly speaking, there's a unity within all of that and a decision. What is German foreign policy? What is Ghanaian foreign policy? What is Egyptian or Israeli foreign policy? And there's a focus, and the political leaders, they take the decision. National interests are objective. Hans Morgenthau, who we'll be looking at shortly, talks about actually you can know what the national interests are, and you just strive for it, and you constantly strategically think about it, think how you can achieve it, and they're always there and they're always knowable. Again, constructivists will be critical of this because they say your national interests are created through the social interaction between actor A and actor B. But for realists, no, they're objective. They're there, they're understood. You don't need to interpret them too much because they are there. Yes, some interpretation will come into play sometimes in terms of how you achieve your goals, etc. But they're there, they're out there, you can see them. So in this sense, almost quite positivistic in that particular way, at least. The principal national interest is that of survival security, as I've emphasized. And again, human nature is important for classical realists. So I want to re-stress that point. And yes, contra a lot of the other theories that you'll come across, liberalism, critical theory, constructivism, feminism, post-structuralism, actually you can separate domestic with international, and domestic is subordinate to the international. So you have to think as a statesperson about how you achieve your actors' goals within the structure. And that structure is fixed, and how can you achieve it? And you strategize accordingly. So this interaction between sovereign states is therefore pivotal. Realists, if you look at realists, they're not saying that we know everything, we say the truth, nothing but, although we are the most obvious, mainstream, predominant theory. What their argument contention is, so they acknowledge, let's say that their focus is maybe too constrained on politico-military relations. Maybe they could focus more on environmental issues or food issues. Let's say if we're talking about security, environmentalism or food security or culture. However, what the realists argue contra this is that actually we do take on board some of the most important questions in international relations, war and peace, these big questions. And so whilst we don't provide all of the answers in every minutiae detail, we provide some of the most important answers to some of the most important questions. And again, self-interest is very important here because there's an anarchical system. There's no overarching authority to protect us. And so we have to survive. We have to protect ourselves first and foremost. And then maybe we can have good or good enough relations with others. Now, again, we are trying to avoid conflict. We're not hawkish, saying we want to have a war at the drop of a hat, and often we can be against going to war. But again, this is because we have to think how power is balanced, a balance of power. Balance of power is an important concept notion in realism. And this equilibrium, this analogy that comes from physics, this equilibrium, balance of power, is how the world works. So if you look at, let's say, 1815 to 1914, so post-Napoleonic Wars, 1815 to 1914, within Europe, Treaty of Vienna, that 99-year period, various different empires were balancing against each other to provide some sort of equilibrium, to create some sort of peaceful conditions. Of course, as we know, between 1815 and 1914, there were conflicts between the different dukedoms, kingdoms, etc., within even Europe too. So it's not that it was all peaceful. But relatively speaking, and certainly if we can't bring in the First and Second World War, it produced this peaceful circumstances, interaction between the states. And this is important. And so that time period is sometimes referred to as Pax Britannica, so peace Britain, as in Pax Romana, and that Britain itself also guaranteed that the different European powers would balance and empires would balance against each other, and therefore they would be the major power in other parts of the world, Africa, Asia, etc. But the point is, it's not that these, in this case now 20th, 21st century, it's not that these states have peaceful relations necessarily, peaceful intentions. It's just because they know that it's best for them and their own survival to balance against other. And actually it's naive, according to realists, to think about cooperation as the natural condition for world politics. Yes, it's a lovely thing, cooperation, and realists are not against it. And they would argue, for example, realists are not necessarily against this notion of being, let's say, anti some of these liberal ideas, even of democracy or human rights or some other areas, or cooperation. However, they're skeptical that this is always the outcome. Why? Because human nature is not this way, and because conflict, we live in this anarchical system. Conflict is a natural condition, and it's better that we're realistic about that point, rather than coming to harm's way and not being prepared. So we don't want to be naive. Like one doesn't want to be naive in one's private life, personal life, one doesn't want to be naive above all else in international politics, according to realism. And it's cyclical. That's why when I refer to a great Greek or Chinese or some great thinker from history, there are timeless laws according to classical realism. And actually, because it's rooted in human nature. So then, again, if we go back to Thucydides as an example. Okay, now key concepts. And again, some of these key concepts could come under the umbrella of realism, broadly speaking, and that security is extremely central. Security, again, when we bring in constructivism, critical theory later on, feminism, we can see that security becomes much more multidimensional, because it's not just politico-military. You have to think about how people are affected on the ground. You have to think about food, environment, culture, a whole host of issue areas. However, for realists, the focus of security is this politico-military factor, and they put an emphasis on security being front and center to international relations. The next major concept is sovereignty, as we come across in this and the previous presentation, and the centrality of it, leave others alone to go about their own business, and that it's really just an international relations between the two state actors, or the multilateralism, where you have an agreement from many different sides, but relations between many different countries. First and foremost, according to realists, you have to respect the sovereignty of others. And hence, realists would be skeptical when they hear the US or the UK talking about promoting human rights and democracy in certain countries, for a couple of reasons. One is because can the US or the UK do it very well? Not necessarily, according to realists. And two, actually, these societies themselves are evolving in their own way, and it's you can well up, and this connects to point one, open up a Pandora's box by intervening in another country. So sovereignty is important, and that this nation state in question should have its own rights. Again, I could talk about responsibility to protect, which we covered in a certain amount of ground last time. But the key point for realists I want to focus on is security, sovereignty, and then the next one is national interest. Objective national interest, materialistic. There is a national interest, we can see it, we can identify it, we can measure it, and we need to try and achieve it. If we are Italy, If we are Ethiopia, if we are Argentina, we can achieve it, and we strive for it, etc. Constructivists, again, also some constructivists argue for a national interest, but again, this national interest is constructed through time, through socialization, through speaking with others, interacting with other states and non-state actors, one's own citizens, to create what it means by a national interest. So it's not taken for granted. For realists, it's there, it's objective, you can understand it, you can measure it, and you just need to try and achieve it. Again, the chessboard analogy. And power politics. Power politics is very, very central. And power, again, is material. It's how strong your military is, how large your economy is, geographical. So not so much ideational, cultural. It's much more these material, which is where we would bring in constructivism and other approaches more here, the relationship between material and ideational factors. No, for realists, it's much more the case. It's material, how large is your economy, but in particular military, geography, and how do you achieve your national interests through this balance of power, but also in some cases, the more powerful states, Russia, China, the US, if they need to, they can flex their muscles. And how do others balance to prevent that from happening? Power politics is always there, and this is insecurity according to realists, classical realists as well, of course. Okay, let's look at silences and limitations of classical realism, and dare I say, or not dare I say more generally, realism in general. Limited attention to the role of non-state actors. You'll see in the next set of slides with liberalism that non-state actors, multinational corporations, MNCs, transnational corporations, TNCs, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, transnational actors, also some that are for the environment, some terrorist actors like Al-Qaeda, so not necessarily all good, some can be very bad, etc., if we make an ethical judgment, but you have to consider these non-state actors, so and foundations and other actors, and you see realists don't put an emphasis. They say, yeah, these other actors are important, yes, Microsoft might be important, yes, it happens to have makes the same amount, or Amazon even more so than many national economies in the world, but nonetheless we have to focus on the state actors because they're the ones that set the rules and regulations, they're the ones that interact, they're front and center, especially most powerful ones. I'm not saying up here who's right or wrong, I'm leaving this up to you to think about, to be pluralistic, but the point is there's a limited attention to the role of non-state actors, arguably a real overemphasis on state actors. And don't really bring economics into it. So political economy, important elements of what makes a nation state powerful, etc. Well, there's political economy, which is very important. Again, liberalism and Marxism in another way we'll look at, but little or no consideration to this. And a very impoverished conception of human nature. Again, going into the 20th century, and we have obviously great thinkers like Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, positive psychology. I'm not going into psychological thinkers per se right now, but the point is, whether we look at it for political theories, psychology, whatever the case might be, it's a very, very impoverished and arguably negative conception of human nature, and it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, if I can't trust you or you can't trust me, then we're going to be distrustful. Therefore, it's likely our interaction's negative. Therefore, the relationship gets worse and it becomes leading to a difficult or conflictual situation. Sometimes known as a security dilemma, which I will talk about a bit later. But the point is, this is one belief system, according to constructivists, amongst a whole host of others, and it's an impoverished conception, arguably, and narrowly state-centric, as I've overemphasized in this particular slide. It's this real emphasis on states and states being front and center is also arguably challengeable. Less an accurate theory of world politics or international relations than the image in and through which world politics was made. Hence, if you think about the Cold War, 1947 to 1991, arguably it's just a rationalization for what these two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were doing, and this bipolar world, this balance of power, so all the allies with the Soviet Union, all the alliances with the United States balancing, and the United States and Soviet Union intervening in parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and supporting through proxy actors one side against the other. Point was, it was arguably a rationalization of Cold War politics, a particular historical context, but it's not the case in every single historical context or international order. So these are some of the silences and limitations. And here I want to refer you to a couple of seminal works that you should be aware of. Hans Morgenthal's Politics Among Nations is probably the seminal text you should be looking at, and his 6 rules for international politics, read in the beginning of the book. a great study, and highly recommended. So please do read this, or at least look at his 6 principles. There's also a feminist response, Anne Tinkner, who's worth reading, and her response to realism. And then there's E.H. Carr's work, the British historian, 20 Years Crisis, looking at this tension between realism and idealism. And Carr himself basically makes the argument that there's nothing wrong with having ethics, values, but it has to be collaborated with power politics, and getting that balance right is very important. And again, Hans Morgenthau also acknowledges that actually there's ethics as a part of the equation. However, and sometimes neo-realists downplay this. However, Hans Morgenthau also made the point that men, women, a statesperson needs to think rationally about what he or she wants to achieve for his state, think of what he wants to achieve for his community, and by doing so, this leads to a better outcome. And actually, paradoxically, if you don't think too much strategically in this way about your own state, paradoxically, you can end up making the situation worse for all. And so Hans Morgenthau, a very, very significant thinker, and probably the seminal, but another thinker of classical realism. Another thinker that's very important is Reinhold Niebuhr, so another major thinker for you to consider. And a case study which we'll have a talk about in class is the US invasion of Iraq. And how would realists see this particular invasion? So you think, of course, and we'll talk about this in class, this emphasis on politico-military relations, that realists would be very much pro-US invasion of Iraq. Why? Because the emphasis on that the US can be powerful. However, can it not just destabilize the region? Can it not just be the case that actually the US is not going to achieve its objective national interest if it destabilizes the region, if it means that the United States has to pour so many resources into Iraq, and therefore leaves it more open to being less powerful in, let's say, East Asia or other parts of the world? Is it really achieving the objectively understood national interest? Is it really stabilizing the region? Is it really putting the United States in this, materialistic speaking, hegemonic leadership position and balancing with others? Some realists, I would say, were very skeptical, and there was a letter in the New York Times 2002 from a range of realist scholars arguing against what became the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Why? Because it undermined the US national interest. Why? Because actually you could actually have some sort of accommodation with the Iraqi government, or at least you could have a difficult relation, but by overthrowing this particular dictatorship, it could make the situation worse rather than better. So a whole host of factors, and that the US had previously had relations with Saddam Hussein, and therefore could contain him, whatever the case might be. There was a whole host of reasons why the realists were against the US invasion of Iraq, but we'll talk more about this in class. Now, to go on. Now, as I put it in this first slide, realism/neo-realism, so classical realism and neo-realism. So you may have noticed that the 1930s, 1940s for classical realists in the discipline of IR over the last 80, 90 years. Now we go into the 1970s, late 1970s, neo-realism, structural realism, and the seminal thinker here is Kenneth Waltz. And then, of course, there are many other major thinkers like Stephen Walt, who writes on foreign policy, John Mearsheimer, you're reading, Barry Posen, etc., etc. However, this is a seminal work, Theory of International Politics, that you should look at, and he is a neo-realist/structural realist. Neo-realist, new realist, or structural realist, these are used as synonyms, okay? So they're used interchangeably in this presentation, because they're used interchangeably in the literature. And realists, they acknowledge that we live in an anarchical system, that we want to survive, that we want security, there's power politics, it's objective, it's materialistic. However, and this is the difference between classical realists who emphasize human nature and neo-realist, structural realists who emphasize the structure of the international system, and how different state actors, how actors act within this structure that's fixed, that's objective, materially speaking. And Kenneth Waltz comes along, and he uses a number in his magnum opus, his great book, Theory of International Politics. He basically introduces in a more systematic, rigorous, scientific, structural way, positivistic. So positivistic that you can study laws in a particular way and make generalizations from that. Post-positivists, which constructivists, feminists, critical theorists, post-structuralists are more in, where they say you can't actually study the natural world the way you can the social world, according to constructivists, feminists, etc. Because you're talking about human consciousness, agency, ideas, culture, and that you can't say because of this that you can make whole, let's say, generalizations from that. However, and this is a debate between positivism and post-positivism. However, to cut a long story short, for Kenneth Waltz, he was critical of classical realism, so critical of Hans Morgenthau for not being scientific enough, needing to be more positivistic in this way. And actually, this notion of human nature, according to Kenneth Waltz, is problematic. So Kenneth Waltz very much admired Hans Morgenthau and the other classical realists. However, he thought that Morgenthau and others, unfortunately, they overemphasized this notion of human nature and the assumptions. And actually, because it's a very fuzzy concept, according to Waltz, you need to be able to let's say, in a hypothetical deductive way, you say, what's my hypothesis? What do I want to test? And you do A, B, C, D, and you can see in the case, let's say, if this happens between state A and state B, then this is the result. And structurally speaking, you look at how large an economy is, how much the military is, how they balance against each other, and then you can, and what type of relations exist, where in the world, etc. And you can make predictions based on that, based off this structure of how actors are working and operating within it. So it makes it more predictable. Of course, there's problematic assumptions with predictability in some cases because human beings are not always predictable. But the point is this deductive approach. So if A, then B. So if this is what happens, this interaction between these two countries leads more likely to this situation. So in that way, the neo-realist structuralists put an emphasis on this positivistic approach, and they put an emphasis on the structure of the international system and not human nature, which is too fuzzy a concept, as I referred to before, in a negative sense, according to Kenneth Waltz. Now, world politics can be analysed as if states were assumptions of unitary. So you have to assume here that states are a unitary rational actor. So they think utilitarianism, my utility. How much can I achieve from this particular? And we get into rational choice theory. Let's say I do a cost-benefit analysis. I have access to perfect information. My hierarchy of preferences. If I don't get one, I go for two. If I don't get two, I go for three as a state. How much can I get? How much can I get out of every interaction? We always want to achieve as much as we can as a state. Like you do in your own private lives, you want to get the most out of an interaction. Let's say if you buy a product, you want to get the most out of it. How much benefit or happiness can you get from it? This is how states operate, but obviously on a much more macro level, about how much they can achieve. And these actors are rational. They do a cost-benefit analysis. They have a hierarchy of preferences. If not one, then two. If not two, then three. And that's it. And they live in this anarchical system, and they can consider, or how do we operate? Do we balance against this powerful actor? If we are, let's say, Latvia, do we balance against Russia by, let's say, becoming part of NATO? Yes, we do. Do we balance against another powerful actor? Or does this powerful actor work more closely with certain actors to actually keep itself in a powerful position? And again, this is a difference between classical realism and neo-realism. So classical realism on one side and neo-realism / structural realism. On the other side is that the structure largely determines what we can do, we as states, and that we're rational and we work within it. And again, this connects with rational choice theory, that a state has one ideal course of action. Therefore, it's determined. There's very little agency. The structure has determined what is going to happen. And this is therefore a much more structuralist approach, which in that way has a connection with structural Marxism, although Marxism obviously critiques capitalism and the inequalities economically speaking, but it basically emphasizes very, very little agency. Of course, critical theory, which takes in Marxist thought, talks much more about agency, ideas, values, culture, and as does, and now I'm going to classical realism, because you bring in human nature, there's some element of agency. Not a huge amount perhaps, but some element. But according to structural realists, no, the structure is largely speaking determined, and there's not very much you can do as a state, and therefore you just need to determine what is the ideal situation and follow it. So a little bit of agency, but not very much. And the state again is sovereign and front and center. So like classical realist, neo-realist / structural realist, I'll just use structural realist or neo-realist going forward. I won't always say neo-realist / structural realist. The state is sovereign, and it's a natural unit of analysis in international relations. It's front and center. Again, neo-realists are not saying, oh, that the state is everything and that we are answering all of the questions in international relations. No, but we are answering some of the most important and central questions that need to be asked. So the important ones, and that's what makes realism the most powerful tool, theoretical framework. Again, each presentation I'm going to present to you, I'm going to promote the particular theory in question. So, key assumptions. The role of international institutions and international government cannot be overlooked. Yes, it plays a role, and so yes, we do need to consider it, according to Kenneth Waltz, Stephen Walt, and others. So we're not entirely ignoring it, okay? That yes, there is a case, and there is a role also for the United Nations. But again, when you think of, let's say, a certain agency or body in the United Nations, like the UN Security Council, or the General Assembly, or the Economic and Social Council, whatever the case might be, the reason why these international organizations, and you may remember from my second presentation, why the UN has, despite its flaws, difficulties, etc., why it still remains in a fairly important position regarding international relations, is, according to realists, because the most powerful states want it to be that way, because the most powerful states benefit. So if you are the US, China, Russia, Germany, South Africa, Brazil, etc., these states want it that way, or they want it reformed, as you remember. Of course, and you might say right now, well, look at the Trump administration. They're very skeptical of international institutions. Yes, and it's arguable that the global order may be in the process of changing anyway, historically speaking. But nonetheless, the reason why it does work, according to realists, is because the most powerful states want it to be that way, because it helps them achieve whatever their objectively understood national interest is, according to neo-realist language. And again, the states seek relative rather than absolute gains. So again, the same example to be clear, actor A gets 8, actor B gets 6. So 8 is more than 6. So actor A has had relative gain over actor B, and therefore state actor A is in a better position, more powerful position than state actor B. And again, absolute gains is when both sides interact. State A, state B, can also be a non-state actor. They interact with one another and both sides benefit, what's known informally as a win-win situation. Then it's absolute gains. And these are terms that are used in economics, microeconomics, for you to consider. But the point is that realists put an emphasis on relative gains. So great powers are the main actors, as I've just referred to. So if you are China, the United States, India, Russia, Germany, etc., etc., it has difficulty explaining. You may notice, and I'm pausing and stopping myself from saying the European Union. Why? Because the European Union is obviously not a nation state. It's a combination, as you know well, of being intergovernmental, but also having some supranational authority, like the European Court of Justice. So it's a combination, it's hybridity in this sense, the European Union, but it's not a nation state. And this is, again, a limitation, arguably, of realism, that they haven't necessarily emphasized how states can interact and how they become a regional bloc, etc., etc. But nonetheless, these great powers that I've just referred to, US, Russia, China, India, Germany, Brazil, whatever the case might be, they operate in this anarchical international system. So no supranational authority. It doesn't mean chaos. And it doesn't mean, like in political theory, that no central authority and therefore we have to collaborate, work together in a decentralized way. No, it just means because there's no central authority, internationally speaking, no one above a supranational authority to protect us. Therefore, yes, there are rules and principles in international relations, and realists would agree with that. But we have to be very wary of what others are doing, because we don't want to be taken advantage of, because, to use a colloquial phrase, it's dog eat dog. We have to, if anything, we do it to them before they do it to us. Obviously, we don't want to have to do something negative, but that's because we can't trust others, because we live in this anarchical system, and often, unfortunately, it leads that way, hence the pessimism that realists have. And again, according to the structure, this anarchical system, states follow what they consider their objectively understood national interests, and they try to achieve something within the structure. The state leaders, they try to achieve it, and often it leads to, not always, but it often leads to difficult and conflictual relations. Not necessarily all out war, but at least difficult relations. And all states, and this is why, again, pessimism, all states, well, this is a correct statement, that all states possess military capability which be expanded upon, but offensive, and it can be used against others according to realists, and therefore you have to be careful. So states can never be certain about other states' intentions. Even if you look right now at France and Germany, we know with France and Germany, historically, they had very tricky, difficult relations. If you look at the last, let's say, 3 wars in the space between 1870 to 1945, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, the First World War, 1914 to 1918, Second World War, 1939 to 1945, France and Germany had very, very conflictual relations. And yes, they're friendly now, using constructivist language rather than enemies. Not even competition, I would say more friends, but we can discuss that. But the point is that because you can never be sure about other states' intentions, you always have to protect yourself, have your military ready, have your security in place, etc., etc. And we're going to get now to this notion, this concept of a security dilemma. What is a security dilemma? And of course, the example of Germany and France is far-fetched because they are now very interconnected. A lot of strangers, culturally speaking, diplomatically speaking, they're very close. So I give an extreme example, but the extreme example is more just to say that even this relationship will not necessarily always be friendly and peaceful, according to structural realists, if we're going to be pessimistic here. Now, the security dilemma is the concept I want to talk about, and I will refer now to China and Japan as the example of the case. China and Japan, historically, we can go back to the beginning of the 20th century, go back further actually, but let's say Japan's dominance in the Northeast, East Asian region, and then we go to the Second World War and some of the war crimes that the Japanese committed, vis-a-vis China, Korea, etc. But the point is, and of course, not that always China itself was always innocent, and it has always been innocent in its relations with Japan, even if we look at let's say, or do look at the last 50, 60, 70 years. Nonetheless, the key point that I want to emphasize is historically a very difficult relation, even today a difficult relationship between Japan and China. So this is the example. Maybe not as negative as something like India and Pakistan over the Kashmir issue, but still a difficult relationship. So here's my example between Japan and China. Security dilemma. If next year or during the year, Japan decides to, because it's concerned about China, it decides to increase its military. So it spends, instead of spending 3% of its GDP, it puts it up to 6% of its GDP. And China detects this, notices this, observes this. They would say, why has Japan put their GDP military, and they have their military GDP is quite a lot, 3%. Why have they put it up? It's not a huge amount actually, but let's say for this example, to 6%. Wow, why have they ramped it up to 6%? They've increased it twofold. Why is that? Why would they do that? Well, we China are probably the biggest threat to them. So if they're doing it, they obviously have, maybe they have hostile intentions towards us. So China, let's say, that also has 3% of its GDP, says, okay, for military, if Japan were to do something to us, although we're very powerful, we must be ready. Let's ramp it up to 7%. So 7% of our GDP is now military. The Japanese notice that the Chinese have ramped it up and say, why have they ramped theirs up? Oh, we were right all along. Maybe they are actually having, let's say, hostile intentions, which could lead to worst case scenario war. We're going to ramp up our GDP. So this security dilemma is because there's a lack of sharing of information, which is what liberal institutionalists emphasize what's important to pool resources to understand each other. But because there isn't that, and there's this lack of trust, again, constructivists would say, because of how these two actors socialized historically towards each other, and because there is this lack of information, lack of trust, etc., etc., a situation where both sides, so this is a security dilemma in a nutshell, where both sides don't want to go to war because of these factors that I've just spoken about, it leads, unfortunately, to war, even though it was unintentional. So it's what's known as the security dilemma. And again, for structural realists, the main goal of a state is survival. So whether it's Japan or China, they want to survive vis-a-vis each other, and they want to protect each other because they are rational actors. They can do a cost-benefit analysis. They have a hierarchy of preferences. They have access to perfect or near-perfect information, although that last assumption, as you can see, is very, very problematic. So I want to just briefly now differentiate between two different types of realists. You've got offensive realists and defensive realists, and they are both structural realists. They are both neo-realists. Defensive realists from the article, John Mearsheimer is the key thinker here. Tragedy of Great Power Politics is one of his major books. And it's that states are always looking to gain more power. Ultimately, they want to be a regional leader, regional hegemon, materially speaking, or even a global hegemon, let's say in the case of Napoleon or Nazi Germany, or of course, once when you refer to Nazi Germany, and then another example, it's not entirely fair, but let's say another example, like the US in the post-Second World War context, certainly compared to Nazi Germany, at least far more benign. But the point is, each of these actors want to be the most powerful, and they want to be the hegemon, the leader, materially speaking. Later on, when we look at critical theory, hegemony also has this notion of interest and culture, how certain elites in a society can socialize others to believe something in a certain way. But again, going to realists and structural realists, it's about material factors, and ultimately states want to be the most powerful in their region or globally. And so China, again in your reading, China's, let's say, development growth in East Asia means that inexorably it's going to want to be the regional hegemon. This is problematic, arguably, for countries in the region like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, etc., and also the US, that has close relations to some of the countries I've just cited. But the point is, John Mearsheimer is saying, don't be surprised that China would want this, because any other country in its position with its geographical, economic, military power would be doing the same thing. And that's this notion from offensive realists. So he's skeptical about the rise of China. Defensive realists, on the other hand, whilst there's a lot of connection between these scholars, so Kenneth Walt, Stephen Walt, Barry Posen, they are defensive realists, and an offensive realist like John Mearsheimer. There's a lot that connects them as well, being structural realists, and a lot where they share similar ideas. But this is the key difference between these two different schools of thought within neo-realism, structural realism, and that's defensive realists. They say, look, this notion of expanding, and like empires did once upon a time in other ways, it's imprudent. We actually have to be careful, because actually conquest is costly and troublesome and difficult. So again, the Iraq War 2003, actually, is it really in our objective national interest to overthrow Saddam? If you're a Marxist and you say it's for oil, or other approaches might say it's for oil, yes, fine, but will you even get the oil? And is it the case necessarily that actually you're in a more powerful position vis-a-vis your own alliances in the Middle East? And is it the case that actually you're more powerful vis-a-vis, I'm talking about the US now, vis-a-vis China? Not necessarily. So the most prudent strategy, whether you're a statesperson for the US or for China or for the UK, or whichever country we're referring to, is to know when enough is enough, to be restrained. If you know when you've got the appropriate amount of power, so it's not that you're not engaged in international relations, you're very much there, but you also need to know when to restrain yourself. And this is a key difference between defensive realists and offensive realists. Defensive realists are continually looking to be the hegemon, the leader in their region, or the world, whereas defensive realists say, yes, you want to be powerful, yes, you want to be engaged in the world, have military bases, maybe in naval bases in different parts of the world, fair enough, but you want to be wary of overstretching yourself. And so evading countries, for example, is potentially very, very problematic for that reason alone. And 9 times out of 10 don't do it. Okay, so the anarchical structure of the international system compels states to act as they do. It determines it. See, it's very much a structuralist approach. You have little agency. There's not much you can do in that sense. And therefore, and accordingly, conflict is exactly that result, not because states necessarily are aggressive towards each other, always having these, let's say, bad thoughts, but actually they live in this state of anarchy. There's no guarantee of anything. You can't know the intentions of others, and you need to protect yourself. And sometimes, therefore, you will do things which lead, unfortunately, to a conflictual or, worse of all, warlike situation. However, what leads to war and what can prevent it? And this is where you have different approaches, different, let's say, terminologies here. And I've put on the stable system here a multipolar system or a bipolar system. Multipolar meaning 3 or more great powers within the international system. Bipolar, like the Cold War, 2 superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union, balancing each other. Bipolar. Multipolar, during, let's say, 1815 to 1914, from that time period where these different European empires were balancing against each other. So whether you talk about later on, of course, Prussia, but later on the German Republic, whether we talk about Austro-Hungarian Empire, whether we talk Ottoman Empire, French Empire, Russian Empire, British Empire, arguably these countries balancing against each other within the European context. The UK, okay, was a bit separate because it had a global role it was playing in the 19th century. But in each case, a multipolar system where there's three or more powers. So if you say today, if you make this argument that the US, Russia, China, EU, not a nation state, but let's just go with it, India maybe, they're balancing against each other, that would be known as a multipolar system, bipolar system, two great powers. At the end of the Cold War, Charles Krauthammer, the commentator, and others made the point that the US was living what was called through the unipolar moment in the 1990s, where it was the only superpower. Now, the problem for structural realists with a unipolar world, we have only one superpower, i.e. in this case, 1990s, the United States. There's no other countries to balance against it, and therefore the United States is likely to do, now to use colloquial English for structural realists, likely to do stupid things, to invade countries in the greater Middle East or wherever, let's say the United States has a particular interest. Why? Because it can, because it's in a very powerful position and other countries aren't balancing against it. So the unipolar world, according to many structural realists, is potentially actually less stable than a bipolar, and in many cases they argue a multipolar world being more stable. However, there are debates amongst realists about which system is more stable and why. And in some cases, even some realists might say, actually, if a state like the US or previously Britain can actually stabilize the system, sets the rules of the road, so hegemonic stability theory now that realists and liberals talk about, just a different emphasis, that you can actually stabilize things, hegemonic stability theory. But usually most realists talk about a more stable system being either bipolar or multipolar. And that's something for you to think about in terms of points in class. And states are inherently conflictual and competitive. Again, I re-emphasize this point that all realists put on. But again, this balance of power is an important way of restraining states and actually protecting them from their worst excesses and each other. And yes, there's always going to be instability. And here you get back to my point about hegemonic stability theory that realists emphasize and also liberals emphasize. Liberals put it more that let's say, the Great Britain from 1815 to 1914, or the United States in the post-Second World War context, liberals, that they would say, look, the United States plays a lead role in the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, GATT, which later on in the 90s becomes World Trade Organization. And you create the rules of the road and you enforce it, and therefore, actually, this is what keeps a peaceful global order. There's a lot of issues with there because it's not peaceful everywhere, and critical theories make that point, post-colonialism does too, but the point is this is what the US's role it can do. And arguably the Trump administration maybe is challenging that right now as we're going into a different global order. Possibly that's an open-ended question. Do we live in a more multipolar world or polymorphic where power is actually concentrated in different parts of the world? The key point here though that I want to emphasize for realists and hegemonic stability, if we talk about this unipolar world, or at least hegemonic stability theory here, is that a powerful state can actually set the rules of it and actually protect its alliances, have alliances, and create a particular rules of the road where the US or whatever the country in question is can be in a powerful position. Hegemonic stability theory. However, for structural realists, it's often the case that we live in a bipolar or multipolar world, and this equilibrium, this balance of power, according to structural realists, is what actually protects us from our worst excesses. So again, balance of power, that last point that I've just emphasized and re-emphasized previously, is front and center to structural realists, and this is how we can restrain and keep us in a somewhat peaceful relations between different states, not because it's the case that states have benign intentions, positive intentions, but more because it creates that equilibrium and we live in a structure, and that's how we ensure some sort of peace in the international system, international order. Hegemonic stability, as I've just referred to, is that there can be one state, one leader, by far the most powerful, that it creates certain relations, creates certain equilibriums in the Middle East, in Europe, wherever the case might be. Historically, the US has played this role over the last 70 years, and it's in the self-interest of the US, both for realists and liberals, but we're talking about realism now. And at the same time, it benefits others because it sets certain rules of the road. For realists, of course, they put more of an emphasis on security, politico-military security. For liberals, they put certain amount of emphasis on economics. But the point is, this is a concept also in structural realism: balance of power, hegemonic stability, and finally relative gains as opposed to absolute gains, which I've said a few times now. But it's that if actor A gets, let's say 8, actor B gets 6, then actor A has benefited over, in a sense, has done much better than B, or has done better than B, I should say, because it's 8 to 6. And this means that actor A, state A, has benefited more. So Brazil and Argentina interacting with each other, or Ethiopia and Eritrea, or that complicated relationship. If Ethiopia gets 8, Eritrea gets 6, then actually Ethiopia is in a better position, and that's not so good for Eritrea. The same for Brazil and Argentina, at least historically. And again, absolute gains, final point, just to remind you, for liberals, both sides can benefit from an exchange, from an interaction, from trade, whatever the case might be. It's a win-win for liberals, but realists are more pessimistic. Okay, silences and limitations, lacks clarity about when and how cooperation takes place. So it's all doom and gloom, so to speak. If I'm to exaggerate now, I'm pessimistic here. Well, actually, we see that often in the world there's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of cases, certain regions where there isn't war. Yes, we know that there are certain regions where unfortunately things continue to take place, but nonetheless, there's a lot of regions, a lot of parts of the world where actually war is very much something that's very unlikely, or is, let's say, outside of the norm. The norm is actually to be living in peaceful conditions, to have good relations or good enough relations. So it doesn't really talk about why states and non-state actors, but why states interact so well in many cases and cooperate. And it doesn't explain, it can't predict, it makes this point that it structures this, and this determines this, and there's an equilibrium, and there's a permanent feature of international relations, and we have to be positivistic, scientific, or a certain type of scientific approach. Well, actually, it didn't explain why this bipolar world that we're living in, Soviet Union on one side, the United States on the other side, and its respective alliances, why, let's say, you have someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary from 1985 onwards, why he tried to change the domestic situation within the Soviet Union, the norms, the rules, how the Soviet Union was as a society, and how it interacted with Europe and the United States and so on. And the Soviet Union accepting giving up a certain amount of power, materially speaking, whether in East Europe or its relations vis-a-vis Western Europe and the United States. This is where constructivism becomes quite a useful tool as one, let's say, theoretical framework that critiques realism. And it was just that both sides are always trying to get more power and always balancing against each other. Likewise, potential limitation is that it's state-centric. The state is front and center. And again, the state center is important, and most theories would acknowledge that. Pretty much all theories would acknowledge it, critical or otherwise. But nonetheless, it is state-centric and overly. And therefore, you need to consider other factors, ideas, norms, non-state actors, etc., etc. And again, a very limited and impoverished conception of state agency. If the structure is largely speaking determining everything, then actually what agency, what choices do states persons make? Why do statespeople make, statesmen and women make good decisions, at least strategically speaking, or make bad mistakes? Doesn't really explain that very well. And therefore, this unity and rationality of the state sometimes is oversimplified. You know, you have a whole host of different bodies, executive, legislative, public opinion, media, playing a role in a business interest, NGOs, and it's simplified. It says, no, it's just the political elites, and that's really how foreign policy and international relations more broadly is done. In class, and this is a picture of the great Chinese philosopher Confucius, in class we'll talk about this question: can China rise peacefully? So think about how China has risen, arguably, materially speaking at least, and we can look at different theories in class as well, but structural realism and realism more broadly we'll look at how, let's say, since 1979 it's opening up to the outside world, to foreign direct investment, how China has grown economically, militarily speaking, more powerful in East Asia, and possibly becoming, or not possibly, is becoming more powerful in different regions, Latin America, Africa, Europe even, etc., etc. Can China rise peacefully? And also based on the premise of the reading from John Mearsheimer in the textbook, can China rise peacefully? I'm not going to say anything further on that, but just to thank you again for your attention, and just to say thank you very much for, again, your attention. Next presentation, so the fourth presentation, will be on liberalism, liberal institutionalism. But for now, have a lovely rest of the day. Cheers. Bye-bye.